Welcome to Halftarah Vayera. We're in Ezekiel chapter 28, starting with verse 25 and going all the way to chapter 29, the end of chapter 29, which is verse 21. So in this Haftarah, we've got Ezekiel speaking about a future day when all the tribes of Israel will be gathered in from the nations, and specifically that God will give out punishment to their enemies. Now, I learned that Ezekiel's kind of unique among the prophets in that he actually gives dates for some of his prophecies. For example, there's 2 dates he gives in this Haftarah for 2 different prophecies against Egypt. One of them was given on the 12th of Tevet. It says, in the 10th month, on the 12th day, in the 10th year, and that means the 10th year of Ezekiel's exile. And this was, in history, this was like 1 year after the beginning of the siege on Jerusalem and about a year before its destruction. And then the second prophecy that he mentions in this Haftarah is, he says it's in the 27th year, meaning the 27th year of his exile, first day of the month. So we know that to be the first of Nisan. And this particular prophecy describes Nebuchadnezzar's attempt to conquer Tyre, and it's before the conflict with Egypt. So in this Haftarah, Ezekiel is warning Egypt of its impending defeat, specifically that one prophecy at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, as I've mentioned Egypt a lot, right? So with the Haftarah emphasizing Egypt, you can probably already see where this Haftarah ties in with the Torah portion, right? Because in the Torah portion, we're talking about some of the plagues, right? So let's take a look at a few more tie-ins with this Haftarah and the Torah portion. So, as I said at the beginning, this Haftarah starts at the end of chapter 28 and then goes through all of chapter 29. But within the whole book of Ezekiel, there's this larger section in chapters 25 through chapter 32 that gives prophecies about the nations that are bordering Israel. And it's telling them, warning them what God has planned for them and why. So we have prophecies against nations like Moab, Ammon, Edom, Tyre, the Philistines, and of course Egypt. These were the nations that were involved in the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. And this Haftarah focuses specifically on Egypt and predicts its downfall. Now, again, this is the clearest tie to the Torah portion this week, because the Torah portion this week basically, discusses the downfall of Egypt, that Egypt from an earlier time, right? The Egypt of the Exodus. And this Haftarah basically tells us that God will protect Israel with a second round of his deliverance. And in protecting Israel, this will result in like a second round for Egypt of God's judgment. Now, there's something interesting that I wanted to point out with some parallels between the Haftarah and the Torah portion when it comes to like literary structure, because I think when we look at the similarities in literary structure, it's going to help us to understand more both what the Haftarah is saying and also what the Torah portion is saying. So in both the Haftarah and the Torah portion, they contain a phrase that's repeated 5 times in the Haftarah and 6 times in the Torah portion. The phrase is, and they will know I am the Lord their God. some variation of that. They will know I am the Lord their God. Now, in the Halftarah, we have they will know, right? So this pronoun in the first instance, the first occurrence, and the fifth occurrence, that refers to the Israelites. That's who they will know. And the middle three of who they is, that's Egypt. So that's a pattern that we see also in the Torah portion. That phrase, they will know I am God, that shows up 6 times, but we have the same pattern of the first and the 6th times it's referring to the Israelites, and those in the middle, that's referring to Egypt. Now, if you have done any studying or learning anything about chiasms, maybe you're getting kind of excited right now, right? Because a chiasm is that literary structure that sandwiches the main theme or the main point in between 2 outer points, right? Now, in English, when we're trying to figure out what's the main point of a piece of text, we'll usually think that it could be in the very beginning or it could be at the end, right? But in Hebraic thought, it's usually the middle point that gets the attention. And so the structure is set up where you have almost like literary arrows pointing to a middle section, letting you know, hey, this is what you need to focus your attention on. So what this structure that we see in both the Haftarah and the Torah portion, what this is showing us, it's probably showing, it's showing us lots of things, but one of the things that it's possibly showing us is that while it's true that the goal of God's people is definitely to know Him, that the Torah's objective isn't just that only the Israelites know God, but that other nations of the world, right, and here specifically the case of Egypt, which represents like world power, that Egypt must also know Him. Isn't that cool? Now, we could spend a lot of time answering the question, well, what does it mean to know God? Because that's a really deep question, right? We could hours and hours and seminars on that. But I do want to focus on one little tiny aspect of what knowing God means, because of the way that this particular little aspect jumped out at me in this Haftarah. And they will know I am Yod He Vav He. Now, we see this in our Bibles as the Lord, where Lord is all capital letters, right? In Jewish Bibles, they may write it as Hashem, which means the name, or Adonai. If it were to keep the Yod He Vav He, Jews would say Hashem or Adonai. But they all referred to Yod He Vav He, that 4-letter name, the name that has a ton of controversy around it. How to pronounce it, when to pronounce it, why to pronounce it. I'm not going to get into any of that. I just want to bring out the point that Yod He Vav He is usually thought of to mean He was, He is, and He will be. In other words, the eternal one. And Yod He Vav He forms the verb to be, but more likely, or more specifically, it's to cause to be, right? The ultimate master of everything. If you caused it to be, you get to be master over it, right? So His name can also mean I have caused to be, I do cause to be, I will cause to be. And it speaks of Him sustaining the world currently, which is really cool and really accurate. Now, things today aren't much different than how they were in the times when the Bible was being lived out. Because now, as it was back then, people would look to things, little g gods or idols, as their source their ultimate source in one area or another. And that's kind of the same as how we do, maybe. Maybe we look to God as our source in some of the big areas, but maybe there's some areas of our lives that we've hidden from Him. And if we haven't let Him in on those areas of our lives, can He really be our source, right? Now, in this Halftarah, Ezekiel, who's speaking for God, he tells Pharaoh, "Behold, I'm against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, that you the great serpent that crouches in the rivers, the one who said, 'The river is mine, and I have made myself.'" Interestingly, in the Hebrew, it literally says, that's the literal meaning, "I have made myself." So mine is the river, says Pharaoh. This means that he's claiming that he doesn't have any need for anything from God. Okay? Pharaoh's saying that he's independent from God and he can order his life just fine without God. Okay? Now, you and I don't have to be Pharaoh to think that, right? Again, those areas that we have kept hidden from God, aren't we saying we can order our lives just fine without God? It's kind of something to think about, right? So Pharaoh says the river is mine. What does that mean? Well, Egypt was actually unique among the nations because it didn't depend on rainfall to irrigate the crops. It depended on the Nile River to overflow, flood, irrigate the land. In ancient times, rain was a sign of man's dependence on God, or in those polytheistic nations, dependence on the rain god, right? So Pharaoh claimed to be a god because he had control over the waterworks in the irrigation system, which wasn't dependent on, in his mind, outside, like a god outside raining down, if that makes sense. So God's warning to Egypt in this Haftarah, and also in the Torah portion, is that Egypt needs to know and to accept that all events are caused by God. God's rule in the world is in every possible sense. Think about that, okay? And as you think about that, also consider that that's our mission as His ambassadors, right? To teach that concept to the world and then to live like we mean it. Now, there's a book that I came across a number of years ago, and I turn to time and time again when I'm trying to understand this concept. All events are caused by God, okay? And that God rules the world in every possible sense. What does that mean? Well, the book is called The Garden of Emunah, and it's by Rabbi Shalom Arush. And he gives a pretty clear breakdown of 3 points to Emunah, which we have translated as faith, but it's more like faithfulness. What does it mean to have to exhibit faithfulness in God, right? So he says that Emunah, some people pronounce it Emunah, which is probably, I think, the correct way. It can be divided into 3 main levels: basic, intermediate, and upper level. And the basic is, and I'm reading from the book here, the basic is the firm belief that everything comes from God by way of perfect divine providence, even in the tiniest and most seemingly insignificant events. That's basic level. Intermediate, in addition to the basic level, you believe that everything God does is for the very best. And then the upper level, in addition to those other 2, God does everything for a specific purpose and and so therefore we should try to understand the message within whatever God does. Okay? Now there's so much to it. I mean, the whole book is on this, and other books written on this concept. But it basically boils down to what is being said in this Haftarah, that God rules the world in every possible sense. And we need to understand that. The nations need to understand that. Now, Pharaoh didn't believe that. He believed that he didn't need anything because he was a god, right? Now, hopefully you and I don't have that issue where we think that we are a god. But we can still learn a practical lesson from this Haftarah when we consider how many times that we might look to something other than God for our support needs, because we think that's what's happening in our circumstance God isn't aware of, or that he can't meet our needs there, right? So in the Haftarah, we see that Egypt's punished for a very specific reason. Ezekiel 29:6 says, "Then all the inhabitants of Egypt shall know that I am the Lord, because you have been a staff of reed to the house of Israel. When they grasped you with the hand, you broke and tore all their shoulders, and when they leaned on you, you broke and made all their loins to shake." And then interesting, prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah 36:6, he says the same message. He says, "Behold, you are trusting in Egypt, that broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it. Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who trust in him." And then in 2 Kings 18:21, there's like almost an identical saying here. "Look, I know you are depending on Egypt, that splintered reed of a staff, which pierces the hand of anyone who leans on it. Such is the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who depend on him." Now, what's going on here is that Egypt was an ally that the tribes depended on in their struggle against Assyria, and then the others in their struggle against Babylon. But it says, the Haftarah says that Egypt was a splintered reed of a staff to lean on. So each time God's people were attacked, the Egyptians, who were supposed to be allies, didn't make good on their promise of assistance. So they were a reed that splinters when someone leans on it for support. Now, Egypt, as I think I mentioned before, represents the systems of the world, right? So that's not who we want to rely on. And in fact, a really good definition of idolatry is believing that anything that appears to be a controlling factor independent of God's will. Okay? Believing in anything that appears to be a controlling factor in the world independent of God. So that takes us back to that definition of emunah that I read, right? God is the only controlling factor in the world. So the message is Egypt won't protect you, no matter how grand Egypt or the surrounding nations think that it is, right? So the final lesson here is that we need to make sure that we don't inadvertently, and certainly that we don't blatantly, lean on promises and systems of thought that aren't going to hold us up in our time of need. A good reminder is Proverbs 3, verse 5 and 6, right? We all know this one. "Trust in Yod He Vav He with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he and He alone will make straight your paths. And I'll see you next week in the next Haftarah.